This morning I want to talk to you a little bit about storms. It's appropriate that the Lord brought the first snowstorm of the year along just in time for this message, but I take no credit for any of the weather that has happened to fall out here. So that's not my fault. That's a much higher pay grade than mine. But I want to say this about the storm that fell. Are you ready? I was ready for the storm. How about you? Were you ready? Some of you? No, exactly. My kind of guy. In the past, I haven't been. So about 2 weeks ago, one of those 70-degree days, I got the ladder out, and I climbed to the top of our house, and I put our Christmas lights out. And this was like the first time in the history that I've ever done that, but the weather was so nice. And so all of you neighbors who are watching or are here who were thinking, what is that guy doing, putting his Christmas lights up at the end of October? This is what I'm doing. I won't be up on the ladder this week like so many of you. And so I was ready for the storm. Here's something we need to recognize in life. Storms are going to happen. And let me give you a definition of a storm. In fact, you can turn to Acts chapter 27. We continue our study in the book of Acts. Only one more message after today on the book of Acts. We'll wrap that up. And Acts chapter 27 is about a storm. In this case, it's a literal nor'easter that blew in and eventually shipwrecked the Apostle Paul on his way to Rome. In our lives, I'm not talking literally about storms, although we certainly had this last weekend. I'm talking about the things that arise unexpectedly and come between us and achieving our goals. In fact, let me give you a definition that I have developed for what those storms are. The thing I'm talking about today. Storms are those powerful forces, people or circumstances that arise unexpectedly and threaten our pursuit of God's calling. So, God has called you to be a husband, or a father, a wife, or a mother, a student, or a good employee. Maybe God's calling you to serve Him in some sort of a ministry through our church or some community organization. Those storms are the things that arise and begin to threaten your ability to complete that task. There are storms that arise and threaten to keep you from doing that thing that you want to do, that you're convinced God has called you to do. And so, relationally, we go into marriage all excited and fired up and realize pretty soon there are going to be some storms. And that can threaten the health of a relationship. We have our children, we love them, and we're thrilled about them and have wonderful plans and hopes and dreams for their future, and realize, maybe about 2 or 3 years old, we're reminded again at about 15, 16, 17 years old, that there are some storms on the way. And we start a new job. We're fired up about that. We like the rate of pay. We love the people. This is the greatest company ever. That's why they were smart enough to hire us. And before long, it's like, wow, what happened to all those people at the company? Why is my boss unreasonable? Why are they making foolish decisions? If I were running the company, why, it's a storm. Maybe financially, maybe health-wise. I want to be healthy. Here's what I want to do. Here are my financial goals. And storms blow in, and they threaten the accomplishment of our goals. Storms are those threats that we face. Here's what today's message is about. Here's Acts 27 and the beginning of 28 in a nutshell. Storms are great gifts when handled correctly. Storms are great gifts when handled correctly. We're going to find in Acts 27 and 28 a character study. The Apostle Paul, a prisoner, defenseless, and on his way for trial at Rome before Caesar, rises to become the hero of this story. And those that have authority, like soldiers and sailors and leaders on this ship and on the island where they're shipwrecked, end up becoming respectful, in fact, dependent upon the prisoner who rises to become the leader. And the difference is Paul's faith in God's ability to get him through the storm helped him to shine in the darkness of night. So Acts chapter 27, we're going to just kind of skim along. Do a thorough reading on your own because it's one of the great, great stories in all the New Testaments. Acts 27, chapter 27, verse 1. When it was decided that we should sail for Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. So they're going to sail all the way from near Jerusalem through the Mediterranean, all the way up the boot of Italy to Rome. And so we get to chapter 9. Time has passed. They're having a hard time at the first few stages of this voyage. Since much time had passed, the voyage was now dangerous because even the fast was over, meaning that's Yom Kippur, and that would have been October 5th in the year that this was written. It's now past. It may be as late as the end of October. The sailing season in ancient times would have run through about the 10th of October. They're really beyond that now. Paul says, I think we're in danger. Let's not go any further this year. We'll just sort of hole up here in this place until the weather breaks next spring and we'll move on. Well, they didn't like that. Look at verse 11. The centurion paid more attention to the pilot and to the owner of the ship than to what Paul said. By the way, a little research this week helped me understand why they did that. Claudius, the emperor, the Caesar at Rome, had put a premium on those who were willing to work late into the season, and he would either give 1.5 or sometimes double pay to those that delivered grain. Rome was under a famine at this time, delivered grain late in the year. This was a grain ship they were on, and so therefore they were looking for a payday, likely is why they pushed ahead anyway. Look at verse 12. The harbor was not suitable to spend the winter in. The majority decided to put out to sea from there. I love this planning. On the chance that somehow they could reach Phoenix. Now, not the desert city. This was a harbor on Crete. And so we're not really sure. We just kind of hope it works out. That's never really a good plan. And so, verse 13. When a south wind blew gently, supposing they had obtained their purpose, they weighed anchor and sailed along Crete close to the shore. They're just staying within the eyesight of the shore. We just want to get it. It's about 30 miles is all they had to go. Let's get to this winter harbor where we can stay. Look at 14. Soon a tempestuous wind called a nor'easter struck down from the land. And when the ship was caught and could not face the wind, we gave way to it and were driven along. By the way, I have underlined verse 15. Could not face the wind literally is could not stand eye to eye with the wind. That is such a great turn of phrase. There are those seasons in life when we just can't seem to look directly into what's ahead of us. The storm in this case, too big. And there's some fear. We couldn't face what was coming down on us from this wind. And so, verse 16, running under the lee of a small island called Cauda, we managed with difficulty to secure the ship's boat. And so the lifeboat would have been towed behind the ship. They had to pull it in because it could likely be lost as this storm began to rage. Verse 17, after hoisting it up, they used supports to undergird the ship. So they're just battening down all the hatches. And then fearing that we would run aground on the Syrtis, those were sandbars in northern Africa, they lowered the gear, so all the sails come down, lowered the gear, and thus, I have this underlined, they were driven along. Not only is the storm too big, engendering fear, but the storm is too strong, helping them to feel weak and helpless. Storms will do that. Circumstances are too big, and they're too strong, and we have a sense of being driven along by the storm we face. And verse 18, since we were violently storm-tossed, they began the next day to jettison the cargo. Man, they're just anything for their lives here. Verse 19, on the third day, they threw the ship's tackle overboard with their own hands. Every spare thing they didn't absolutely need was going over the side of the ships. Verse 20 is a pretty desperate situation. They find themselves unable to navigate. They don't know where they're going. They don't know east, north, south, or west. And when neither sun nor stars had appeared for many days and no small tempest lay on us, all hope of our being saved was at last abandoned. Not only is the storm too big and too strong, it's too threatening, and they're given into despair. What was coming along, it was too strong, it was too big and overwhelming, and so we're just going to give up hope. When we find ourselves in a situation where there are circumstances beyond our control, we feel tossed by the storm, and we're tempted to give up hope, there are some questions we need to ask ourselves. Questions when you're eye to eye with the storm that help define exactly what we're to do next. Let me give you the three that I believe we should ask questions during a storm. Where am I going? This is the question of calling. God had told Paul 2 years prior, you will testify before Caesar at Rome. Paul, when I called you to myself in faith, it was 20 years before this, I said, you're going to be someone who will testify to Jesus Christ's power to save. And I promised you, you are going to Rome, you're going to Rome. That call anchored Paul's feet. We're in a storm, we need to ask a question, where am I going? Do I have a clear sense of what God has called me to be and to do in this season of my life? When the storm is in marriage, husbands, we need to lock down the understanding God has called me to love my wife as Christ loved the church. And wives, when the storm is flying and husbands are not responding as they ought to, God's calling you to love and respect your husband as the church responds and respects to Christ. Parents, those storms rage, and we're going to lay out boundaries. We're going to put loving, firm guidelines. We're going to instruct and encourage our kids, and still there'll be storms. We need to recognize where I'm going is raising a child that ultimately has the maturity to be self-disciplined on their own. And my job gets hard. Tough things. What am I doing? Where am I going? Recognize God's called us to those jobs to do our best to make a difference for Him. And so I need to ask the question, where am I going? What's my calling? Second question, why am I here? This is not the issue of calling. This is the issue of clarity. Why right now am I on a storm-tossed ship in the middle of the Mediterranean, not sure where I'm headed? Let me give you an answer to that in some people's cases. Because of my own choices. And let me give you the follow-up to that, and that's just fine. The honest truth is when we are clear in our calling, hey, this is what God's called me to do, we're going to invite some storms. We're going to be swimming upstream. We're going to go against the current. We're going to have to eye with the wind in times. And when I have the clarity of saying, I know why I'm here. I'm facing the headwinds now because I am pursuing the calling God has placed on my life. And you know what? We can stand out to a lot when we have that clarity. Third question we need to be able to ask in times of storm is, what am I learning? This is the question of growth. God doesn't waste storms. God uses them for our good, for His glory. So, what is it that the Lord has taught me in this time of need, this storm-tossed season of life? We're going to see in just a moment about what God taught Paul through that. And Pastor Charles Swindoll writes this: every calling involves sacrifice. There's no such thing as a decision without a downside. Man, let that sink in for a minute. Why am I here? Maybe my choice to follow God's good calling on my life has brought me to a storm-tossed place. There's no decision that doesn't have a downside. But listen. On occasion, what you have to give up is significant. But when a calling is genuine, you count the cost. None of the sacrifices feel like a hindrance. This is so true in my life. Listen to this last sentence. On the contrary, the challenges become invigorating. We're in a storm, sometimes by our own choice to follow God's will. Rather than give way and despair and fear, we say, you know what? Bring it on. This is what God called me to be and to do. I will go through it for His glory and my good. And look at what happens in chapter 27. a little further. Verse 20 is a hinge. The focus shifts from what happens on the ship into what happens in the hearts of the people that are the main players in this narrative. Paul is going to tower as a leader in the storm. And those that had authority over him are going to be shown to be pretty weak. And let's talk about how people treat us in storms, shall we? This is what this focus is next. Look at verse 21. Paul, love his heart. Love the way he's just so clear on his calling, he can have a good understanding of what to do next. Since they had been without food for a long time, Paul stood up among them and said, by the way, every parent should love this next sentence. Men, you should have listened to me and not set sail. I told you so. Now, wives, take it easy on us. But leaders don't stop with diagnosing the problem. Okay? They go to providing leadership through the storm. Look at 22. Now I urge you to take heart. There will be no loss of life among you, only of the ship. For this very night there stood before me an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I worship. And he said to me, do not be afraid, Paul. Why? Storm, threatened with my life, not sure where we're at. He said to me, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar. I love how the angel that God sent to bless Paul said, Paul, go right back to that calling. Remember what I called you to do? Remember who I called you to be? Remember where I said you'd go? Nothing's going to change about that with the storm. Look at verse 25. Take heart, men, for I have faith in God. Do you? In fact, look at Paul's faith. I have faith in God that it will be exactly as I have been told. God made promises to me as part of my calling, and I trust that He is keeping those promises even when I don't know where I'm at or which direction I'm headed. Calling gives us such a sense of calm in a storm. And it is Paul's faith in the goodness and the power and the direction of God at a time when he has no idea what's next that not only sustains him, but allows him to be able to become a leader in this storm. Verse 27, the scene begins to shift to, well, how did the others handle this? And 14th night. We just read it and don't even think about it. 2 weeks not knowing. Every hour in danger of your life. "14 days had gone by and they were being driven across the Adriatic Sea, and about midnight the sailors suspected they were nearing land. So they take soundings, they measure this, and they find that they're first 120 feet, and then they're 90 feet, so they're rapidly approaching some sort of an island. They're fearful of a shipwreck, and love verse 29, fearing we might run aground on the rocks, they let down 4 anchors from the stern, that's the back, and they prayed for daylight." You been there? I don't know, I just don't want to run into a shipwreck here. And now, look at verse 30. As the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship and had lowered the ship's boat into the sea under the pretense of laying out the anchors from the bow, and so they're putting anchors in the back, let's go put the anchors in the front, and what they're really doing is secretly letting down the lifeboat so that they can escape. The sailor's like, we're out of here. Paul, 31, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, hey, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. All the experienced sailors gone? We have no hope. And verse 32, soldiers, they took pretty strong action. The soldiers cut away the ropes of the ship's boat and let it go. How do people around us respond when we're in a storm? Well, some people abandon us. That's the sailors. Hey, we're really not too concerned about how you survive the storm. We're just thinking of me, of us. And people we thought we could trust, we thought they'd be near us, and when storms blow, they're gone. Paul, again, rather than abandoning in a time of need, shines as someone who meets a need. Look at verse 33. The day was about to dawn. Paul urged them to take some food. Hey, it's been 2 weeks, he says. You haven't eaten. And I can imagine seasickness and whatever. These guys were probably very weak, constantly under stress. And look at verse 34. Not a hair of you. This will give you strength. Not a hair is to perish from the head of any of you. I mean, Paul just rises to such faith. God has said we'll survive. I believe we'll survive. And verse 35, when he had said these things, he took bread. Man, in the middle of the Mediterranean, helpless before a storm, soon to be shipwrecked, he gave thanks to God. Man, that's good. He did it in the presence of all. Look at verse 36. All were encouraged and ate some food for themselves. Do you see in a storm, when you stick with it, when you have a strong faith, you actually become an encouragement to other people also going through that storm. And 276 persons in all were on the ship. And when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship by throwing out the wheat into the sea. And now it really gets tough. The morning is broken. They recognize that there's an island over there. And so, verse 39, when it was day, they did not recognize the land. They noticed a bay with a beach on which they planned, if possible, to run the ship aground. And so, hey, we're going to go that way. Let's get as close as we can. And verse 40, they cast off the anchors and left them in the sea. And they loosened the ropes that tied the rudders. So they're getting the rudders ready to steer. And they hoisted the foresail to the wind. And they made for the beach. This is the best we can do. Let's go, go, go. And like most plans in a storm, it didn't work out that way. And verse 41, striking a reef, they ran the vessel aground. The bow stuck and remained immovable, and the stern was being broken up by the surf. Now they're in a world of hurt. They haven't reached the shore yet. The back of the boat is now breached and open, beginning to sink. The bow is stuck, and what are you going to do? Well, here's the second thing some people do when we face storm. Look at verse 42. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners. How's that sound for a plan? Bad if you're a prisoner. The soldiers had that plan because if the prisoners escaped from their custody, they would face whatever discipline that or whatever punishment the prisoners had. And recognize not only will some people abandon you in the time of storm, some people will take advantage of you. Some people will abuse you. Sometimes people in authority over us take advantage of us. Maybe you're here today and your storm has to do with somebody you trusted, somebody you thought you could count on, and they are taking advantage of you. That's hard. That's a storm that leaves us with very little option. And so look at what Paul does. Verse 43. Paul had befriended the centurion, and the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them, that is the soldiers, from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and make for the land, and the rest on planks or pieces of the ship. So it was that all of us were brought safely to land. Somebody's trying to take advantage of you, and especially somebody who has authority over you, you need someone else to help. Don't keep that stuff secret. Find someone you trust, and you just lay it out. Find someone you trust, and lay it out. And in doing that, you may find that God would use the encouragement, the advice of that person to save you from more abuse or being taken advantage of. Chapter 28, verse 1 starts with the scene now on shore. Whether they floated in on a cask or whether they were able to swim to shore, all arrived safely, just as God had promised. All the lives have been saved. And we learned that the island is called Malta. It's a very tiny little island in the Mediterranean, not far actually off the tip of the boot of Italy. And look at verse 3. It's like Paul can't catch a break, right? He's been wrongly imprisoned. He's been on a ship and now in a storm, and now he's been shipwrecked, and he's about to be snake bit. It's just like from one thing to the other. And so, verse 3, when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and put them on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened on his hand. So, clomp, ah! Now, look at how helpful the islanders are. When the native people saw the creature hanging from his hand, they said to one another, "Quick, let's help him." Is that what they said? No. No doubt this man is a murderer. Let me ask you a question, Islander. What do you know about Paul right now? What's the answer? Nothing. It never ceases to amaze me how those who know the least say the most. Some people will abandon you in a storm. Some people will abuse you in a storm. And some people will accuse you. Yeah, well, she's getting what she deserves. Yeah, well, I suspected all along something, something, something. That doesn't help. Can I just say the obvious? In fact, these people are so opinionated, they have an opinion no matter what happens. And so, look at verse 5. He, however, shook the creature off into the fire and suffered no harm. In verse 6, they were waiting for him to swell up or suddenly fall down dead. Is that not twisted? I just picture sort of the, okay, Paul, anytime, now let the show begin. Okay, Paul, feeling that headache yet? Paul, any swelling yet? In fact, look at, they're so determined about this, verse 6, at the end of verse 6, when they had waited a long time, no help, no offer to get a doctor, just kind of like, this guy's going down, he deserves it. And then when he doesn't fall dead, look at what happens next. The end of verse 6. They changed their minds and said that he was a god. Some people, when it's going good, they think you're the greatest. And when there's a storm, they think that's the worst. Those are not friends. And this is going to sound hard, but let me just be real honest with you. If you're in a storm because of your calling and you're pursuing something God's called you to do, you're going to find in storms people will abandon you, take advantage of you, and accuse you. Here's what's hard to hear but true. So what? That makes no difference whatsoever to God's calling in my life to do the right thing, even in a storm. And it was Paul's lockdown faith in God's promise that got him through abandonment and the threat of abuse and the accusation and allowed him to triumph through the storm. As a matter of fact, look at verse 7. You think Paul didn't rise as a light that shined in this storm? In the neighborhood of that place were lands belonging to the chief man of the island, named Publius, who received us and entertained us hospitably for 3 days. It happened that the father of Publius lay sick with fever and dysentery. Paul visited him and prayed, putting his hands on him, and he healed him. When this had taken place, the rest of the people on the island who had diseases also came and were cured. How's that for being a bad guy? In fact, I love verse 10. Now listen. Verse 10 does not happen until I go through all the other stuff. They also honored us greatly. That day comes. It comes when the storm's over and we've shown ourselves to be a man or a woman of faith. Look down at verse 14. When the spring came along, they left. They booked passage. They arrived in Italy. Verse 14 is the end of a promise. It's a 5-year dream of Paul now coming true. There we found the brothers. We were invited to stay with them for 7 days. And so we came to Rome. Remind me, what did God promise Paul years ago? You're going to testify in Rome. What happens here in verse 14? He arrives in Rome. Let me say some things about storms. Some things that need to be said. First of all, recognize that storms both reveal and build character. Storms both reveal and build character. I have had friends who have gone through incredibly devastating storms. And I have watched them be revealed to be men of character. But other friends who have gone through difficulties, and they've shipwrecked their lives. What was on the inside got revealed. Storms also can build character. I have seen those who have gone through difficult times become so strong and so gentle and so grace-filled. Recognize the storms will both reveal and build my character. Second thing, remember that storms are the journey, not the destination. Storms are the journey, they're not the destination. What we go through when we go through a storm is on the way to something else, that thing God called us to do. Do not lose hope. And so, question, how do I handle a storm? How can I come through this thing stronger than ever? Well, prepare before the storm. Do you have a clear sense of what God's calling is? Given the circumstances you find yourselves in right now, are you able to say, what God wants me to be and do right now is? The more clearly I define that, the more likely I am to be able to get through not just surviving, but thriving. Secondly, focus during a storm. I didn't say focus on the storm. That's easy to do. We see all of this around us, and it's just so painful and fearful. And all along, Paul said, and I believed that what God said would be true, exactly as he promised. And that faith became such an anchor that while he was aware of the storm, he was a clear-eyed realist. His focus was what God was going to do in his life down the road. Focus there. Third, persevere through the storm. When our focus is on what comes after the storm, we have an awful lot of strength to persevere through the storm. The storm is what we go through to get to the destination to which God has called us. And so, you maybe have never heard of her. You'll probably know her by the end of this story. But Margaret Brown, very wealthy woman. She married someone who found one of the great gold strikes in Colorado. One of the things she did with all of that wealth was she booked passage on the very first maiden voyage of the greatest ship of the ancient world, the Titanic. April 15th of 1912 at 11:20 p.m., they struck an iceberg in the North Atlantic. You know the story. 2 hours, 20 minutes later, the rear of that ship reared up, and it plunged underneath the icy waters. 1,500 lost at sea. But hundreds survived, including Margaret Brown, who was assigned to lifeboat number 6 under the care of quartermaster Robert Hitchens. And they were just rowing away in the lifeboat as far and as fast as they can because they knew when the Titanic went down, it was going to create a vortex with the potential to suck some of those other lifeboats with them. Margaret Brown, nicknamed Molly, she pushed back hard with Robert Hitchens, and she said, we are going back to rescue people in the dark, hearing the cries of those who'd survived. He said, no, our first priority is to survive. She said, our priority is to go back, and she took the oar away from him. I love this spirit. He only had one oar left. She went on the other side. She began to row, and they went back to the site of the sinking. They did their best to rescue any who were still afloat, whether it be on life preservers or whether it be on little pieces of the ship. They nicknamed her the unsinkable Molly Brown. Because even in the face of a storm and death and all that went on there, she never lost sight that it wasn't survival but rescue that she had been called to provide. Let me pray for us. Close your eyes, bow your heads. And let me just pray for you. Some of you right now, all you're thinking is survival. Man, I'm praying that God opens our eyes to see beyond survival, to say, God, you've called me to this for a reason, and I will not give up. And I will believe your promises. And I will remember what it is you've called me to be and to do. Father in heaven, I pray for your grace in the lives of those sitting here today who are in the storm. Father, some of us may face storms because of choices we've made to honor you. God, give us the courage and the grace to go eye to eye with the storm. Lord, some of us know people going through storms. God forbid that we would ever abandon or take advantage of them. Help us to weigh our words very carefully, Lord, as we speak about them and to them. And God, I pray that you would do your work of building and restoring our character, strengthening us to fulfill your calling on our life through the storms. Most of all, I pray that the good news of Jesus Christ would be clear on display in our lives. And Lord, any that don't know him would turn to Christ as Savior. We ask this in his name. Amen.